I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today, I'll be talking with the popular author, podcaster, science promoter, and ex-Mormon atheist activist, Aron Ra, who will tell us exactly what is wrong with creationism.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
My guest today is Aron Ra, a former Mormon who's now an atheist activist and science educator living in Texas. He is a regional director of American Atheists. Aron is the author of the book, Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. He has lectured and debated all over the world. He has produced YouTube videos about skepticism and atheism, including Refuting the Irrefutable, Proof of God, and How Aron Ra Disproves Noah's Flood. So Aron, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. On the Disproving Noah's Flood, I recently did a video that also addresses that. That series, that 8-part series, talked about how archaeology, geology, meteorology, anthropology, and even mythology disproved the flood. But one thing I didn't get into was the ship specs, the aspects of the so-called ship that was involved in the ark. And I just uploaded a video about that too, just a couple of days ago.
Well, it isn't just archaeology and all that. It's also just kind of common sense, isn't it? When you think about all the different myths in history and all of that.
Yeah, well, what you have is you have a handful of myths from the Near East where most of them name the character Ziusudra, and if they don't name the Ziusudra, they identify a character under a new name, whether it's Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, but they also identify him as the son of Ubartutu. So we know that even with the name change, we're still talking about the same character. And even those that don't mention that name do mention the name of the city of Shuruppak, which was the location of the original deluge of the Euphrates, when the Euphrates overflowed around 2900 BCE.
So speaking of names, when I first heard your name, Aron Ra, I wondered, is this guy like the love child of a Mesopotamian queen and an Egyptian pharaoh or something? Aron Ra. So that's your real name then, right?
It is now, yes. What happened was when I got into Usenet around about Y2K, I needed a handle. My name is already Aron, and I had been reading up on the history of monotheism, and I saw that the Egyptian composite Aaron sun god, Amen Ra, seemed to be a template for the god of Western monotheism, which originally was a volcano god, then a volcano, air, and sun god itself.
Yeah.
So they seem to have merged together. They even had the same wife at one point, whether her name was Asherah or Atheret. So I just, without thinking much about it, I just chose the handle Aron Ra, and then kind of got popular under that name. And then eventually, with the book that came out and everything, and I was going to run for office in 2016, and I remember everybody knew me by this other name, so that may as well be my name now.
So is Aron like from the Book of Mormon or something? Or that's just a name?
Oh no! I was baptized in the Mormon religion, but I never identified as Mormon. Most of my family are Mormon, but I just couldn't call myself a Mormon, not even when I was a little kid.
Wow.
And my logic was, how do I know I don't know everything that is required to be a Mormon, that every belief that would be required, and not having studied any other religions either, how would I know that I don't resonate more with one of them? And I feel like kind of like a freak because I don't know anybody that ever thought of it that way. If your parents are Anabaptist, then you're Anabaptist. And unfortunately in Texas, they think, okay, your parents are Republican, then you're Republican.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's kind of, keep it in the faith, keep it in the family. We have a show called Ask an Atheist that's on every Wednesday live on Facebook Live. And recently we asked the viewers of our show, Ask an Atheist, who they would like to see as a guest on this show on Freethought Matters. And your name kept coming up. So you've got a bit of a following there. So here we are. It's divine providence.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So tell me about your book. I think it was 2015, Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism.
So what happened is, as I said, when I got into Usenet, I started arguing with these people with the creationists, and I found myself on Talk.Origins, where I had scientists on one side and I had the creationists on the other side, and it wasn't hard to tell who had the goods and who didn't. So I noticed that the same arguments kept coming up over and over again, and how many times can you answer the question? There's no transitional species. Here's the list, right? And then so I pick up all the other subtleties of the associated arguments, and I realized that there were about 17 consistent repetitions of the same type of falsehoods. I mean, the foundational falsehoods are that the creationists will not admit these things. So you cannot get them to admit that transitional species actually exist. And in fact, the first moderated debate that I ever did, my opponent said that he knew that there were transitional species in the fossil record, but he wanted to teach students in public schools that there were none, because he said it was important that they believe there are none.
So isn't it true that many of them say, well, there's these gaps between species, but when you find a transitional species, they just say, well, that just makes two gaps now. Don't they say that?
Well, that's not how these people think. I mean, they want absolute mathematic proof that they're wrong, but they don't require any sort of evidence that they're right. They can go to the most baseless assumption from any logical fallacy, or a collection of every logical fallacy. The combination, like God of the gaps, is itself a combination of the question-begging fallacy, which is ubiquitous throughout all religions, coupled with the fallacious arguments from ignorance and incredulity. And then there's also appeal to emotion and a number of others. You just put all different kinds of irrational thinking together, and including confirmation bias and unfair double standards. And so you have a completely factless position that you can believe in completely, and announce that and declare that this belief, this unsupported assertion you have, is the absolute truth. But you won't admit any truth, no matter how well demonstrated, for the other side. So when I say, okay, here's the definition of what a transitional species is, and here's how to identify what a beneficial mutation is, and here are all these examples from science through peer-reviewed literature, all of these things that we can prove meet every one of those criteria, but they will never admit that.
Yeah.
And that's what makes creationism fundamentally dishonest.
So
it
I
is
used to be
not possible to defend creationism honestly.
I used to be a creationist, but not at that level. I just believed, God created everything and he did it his own way. And maybe there's these arguments here and there about, how long is
that's an important point that I should mention. I mean, there's a lot of people that are creationists, and they think that maybe the things that they don't understand, maybe, there are smarter people than them that understand these things. There are, somebody with science degrees or some authority somewhere has a better understanding of these things. But then when they get into arguing the topic, I will put them in a position very quickly where they have to make a choice, whether they are going to remain honest or whether they are going to remain creationist, because it will no longer be possible to be both.
Yeah, well,
when confronted with the foundational falsehoods, and you're going to have to concede, this is the definition of what these words actually mean. Here are the examples that fit every criteria, and so on. And for the counter arguments, like that. Nebraska man or whatever that they try to bring up. Here's the actual story about that. Here's what the case really was. This guy didn't convince the whole worldwide scientific community. As a matter of fact, every scientist wrote against him and everybody demanded more evidence. He convinced no one. So, all of the creationist arguments are themselves fallacious. And people getting into these arguments, they realize immediately they can't defend their position. And then they have to decide whether they're going to change their mind or whether they're going to start lying knowingly.
So these are all intellectual questions and scientific and sometimes even historical questions. But I remember when I was a believer, I was not driven by those concerns. I was driven more by faith and loyalty and to some degree emotion, the fear of judgment, the fear of, heaven and hell, all of that, the lack of moral compass, all of those things were really what was behind it all. And this veneer of intellectual defense of creationism really wasn't what was driving me. And so it's hard to talk to people like that. But I want to ask you, why do you care? I mean, you were raised Mormon, you don't believe it, and now you don't believe. But what is it that drives you to be out there on the road and doing debates and doing your YouTube videos?
Well, I've seen that nobody is more passionate against smoking than an ex-smoker. They understand just how addictive it is, and religion is highly addictive. It causes a release of the same endorphins as taking narcotics. And scientific studies have shown that. And so it is, as you say, an emotional thing that doesn't bear intellectual scrutiny, but that was never something that worked for me. I mean, there's like I was told all the time that if you don't believe, that skeptics or cynics who are missing out on the big picture that only believers can understand, and they have this happy, clappy little fantasy that they embrace as long as they don't look too deeply at it, because, as they say, the devil is in the details. But for me, I had to know what is actually true, because I don't just want to believe things, I want to understand them and improve my understanding. So I have to be able to discern what is true and what is not. Yeah. And when it's necessary that your information be correct, and you find out that if something that I believe because I'd been told that there's all this evidence for it, and then I find out that the evidence is actually invalid or fraudulent or whatever, I will abandon that belief. That's it. I don't even need to have it proven wrong. It's enough to show that I don't have adequate foundation to believe it in the first place. I already don't believe it. It's done.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how fond of it I was. But with religious belief, it's impaired. And I've talked to a number of people. I'm not saying that this is the way with you, or even necessarily most people, but I've talked to a whole bunch of people who have admitted to me in one way or another that they are going to keep believing what they want to believe, even if they know that it's not true.
Yeah, well, because when someone like you and I learn that we are mistaken, we can swallow hard and say, well, I guess I was wrong. But you and I don't have the fear of judgment and eternal consequences and the fear of hell. We don't have all of that, or the fear of being loyalty to your family and your faith. None of that's behind us. And so isn't that an impediment, being a part of a group that you have to kind of conform with? Isn't that kind of the problem we're dealing with religious belief?
I have lost so many family and friends over religion, and now not just religion, but over politics, which is surprisingly even less rational than religion. But politics and religion both kind of cover the same area. They're both community-based. They're both moral judgments, or they're claiming to be moral judgments. Although there's a lot of immorality being cast as morality, which is another aspect that religion and politics share in common. And creationism isn't so much a science question, and it's not really much of a religious question either. It was always a political question. I mean, it was always a means of manipulation and motivation. How to get the masses to do what you want to give us power. That's what this is really all about. Controlling what people believe so that you can manipulate how they vote. And that's one of the reasons that it's imperative to deal with these people. Wow. When I got into the activism, to answer your question, it was because when I joined talked about origins in session and started arguing with these creationists, I happened across a group of Reconstructionists who were bragging that, all of these ministers, their ministers had been on the phone with other ministers and everything to get all of their collective congregations to vote as a block in order to elect certain Christian nationalists in key positions as judges or senators or school board members or what have you. And that the goal then was to have the entire government dominated by Christian nationalists so that they could have a court case like Kitzmiller versus Dover, wherein they thought that the judge would rule their way and thus make creationism the norm and criminalize evolution. That was a first step before in what they called a culture war, wherein they would then establish all of, they would, people having been taught to distrust evolution would then be susceptible to creationism, and then you can just enforce all kinds of religiosity. And the Reconstructionists that I was talking to were an extreme sort who wanted to erect a government that would not only take down our democratic republic, then replace it with a theocracy. They wanted a theocracy, an authoritarian theocracy that would enforce Levitical law.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It was like being in a James Bond movie when the villain tells you their plan when they think it's too late to do anything about it. And I felt also like it was too late to do anything about it, but I had to try. And so that's what got me doing this, doing my channel, so that I could have all of these, the arguments for the foundational falsehoods. I've made individual videos for each one of those, so that people without a background in education or science would understand the arguments being made and the evidence against that claim.
Aron, we have to take a break right now, but when we come back, I want you to tell us what it was like to debate the famous creationist, or maybe infamous creationist, Ray Comfort. We'll be right back after this.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I'm Charlotte, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I've always been intrigued by religion, and when I was younger, I desperately wanted to be religious, to be more accepted by my family, who was in majority Catholic. My parents didn't raise me religious. I was never baptized. I never took communion. Well, once I took communion. It was a pretty bad idea. I don't think it was worth a church full of angry elderly who glared at me as I waved the communion wafer back and forth, asking my grandma what should be done with it. Also, the wine was pretty gross. From this experience and countless others, I came to 3 conclusions that sort of dictate how I live my secular life. One is that I find people of faith to be more exclusionary and less accepting. 2 is that I would rather work to please the people around me who I care about than someone who, to my knowledge, doesn't exist. And 3, that I would rather help people than pray for them.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with the popular author and atheist activist and science educator, Aron Ra. So Aron, you were debating these creationists, and I think we need to point out that not all Christians are at that extreme in their creationism. Many of them are more moderate or even more liberal in their interpretation. But you debated one of the extremists, Ray Comfort. What was that like?
Ray Comfort is, he doesn't represent most people, or most creationists and such, because as we said, most people believe sincerely that they have some justification to hold their position. And when they get into an argument with me, they'll find out quickly that they don't. And as I said, they have to make that important choice. But Ray Comfort has been to those crossroads, and he took the wrong way, and he knows that what he's saying is not true. Look at the way that he misrepresents everything. He's been arguing with what he calls evolutionists every day of his life for the last 30 some odd years. So he knows better than the straw man arguments that he makes, like the one that he presented when he was talking to Pat Robertson, where he says, let's pretend I'm a evolutionist for a minute. There's a big bang and life begins. And after millions of years, there's like a lump of hamburger that suddenly grows eyes, legs, and a tail. And it becomes a dog, and it becomes a male dog. And then it has to go look for another lump of hamburger that spontaneously grew eyes, legs, and a tail, and became a female dog. Because creationists somehow think that males and females are different species from each other and had to evolve separately. Ray Comfort has been corrected on that point so many times. There is no way that he could honestly believe that that is the actual position that evolution talks about, or that the evidence points to. There's no way there's no way that anybody can be that dumb and still make the millions of dollars a year that he does. So he is being deliberately deceptive. And when I had the debate with him, I told him that his only strength was in pretending that he couldn't understand simple things.
So when you do debate creationists, those extremists, do they have anything? What would you say is their, even though it's bad, what is their strongest argument?
Well, I think it's that they rely on logical fallacies, and they're unable, it seems, to recognize that they are logical fallacies.
When they do give arguments that are supposedly positive, what do you think would be their strongest argument? Would it be design or?
When it ultimately is God of the gaps. I mean, they want to say that science can't explain this or that or the other thing, and that anything that science can't explain, it is, if it's unexplained, means that it is explained by magic. So they believe in, and of course, when I say magic, refers to the supernatural. If it's supernatural, then it's magical. So they believe in the supernatural. Anything that is unexplained by science somehow is explained by their default assumption that there's a God, and he does his magic or miracles or whatever you call it. He poofs things out of nothing. He creates man with a golem spell. That's what they think is the default. And so they expect that we have to disprove the God, which is their default assumption, and they don't understand that. Don't know if it's unexplained, it means it's unexplained. If we have evolution, we have all these other processes we can point to. You have what? Magic invisible man?
Yeah. Like
you have to show that there's a magic invisible man.
Like you scientists admit that you don't have an answer for this. Aha, you don't have an answer, but we do. And
yes, we have a wrong answer.
So was there an Adam and Eve?
Even Francis Collins, who is currently the director of the National Institutes for Health, he was formerly the director of the Human Genome Project. He's also an evangelical Christian. And he wrote a couple of books wherein he said that Adam and Eve are not possible, that it's only folklore, that it is genetically impossible for the current diversity of humanity to have come from one couple at all, period, but certainly not one couple 6,000 years ago. And so he goes into detail about why this is impossible. But here's an evangelical Christian saying that this part of the Bible is just folklore.
Yeah.
And then there are other Christians, scholars, scientifically trained, like Kenneth Miller, for example, who was a star witness in Kitzmiller versus Dover. He calls himself a traditional Catholic. He also says it's genetically impossible for there to have been an Adam and Eve, and for all of humanity to have descended from this one couple. It's impossible for any species to have descended from a single couple. In point of fact, when we're looking at the type of population genetics that are involved here, it would not be possible to even if you had a time machine and an infinite lifespan, you would not be able to find and identify the first human, because that human or that being is going to be virtually indistinguishable from the previous generation and from their siblings and from the subsequent generation. Where do you draw the line? Because the changes are so subtle.
And even if there were and Adam and Eve, they wouldn't have come out of the Middle East. They would have come out of Africa. We know that as much. So
that's an interesting thing. The creationists will argue that, like mitochondrial Eve, there was one scientific range of dates, 150,000 to 6,000 years, according to the burgeoning technology. And so when this one person made a study that said that it could have been as recent as 6,000 years for the most recent of the mitochondrial Eves, because there's a sequence of them, the creationists grabbed that and assumed there was only one Eve, and it was that one. It was 6,000 years ago. It also confirmed that she was from Africa, but the same people who were touting that study denied that she could be African because they refused to admit that they have African ancestors. And this illustrates another problem because they insist that the so-called races are all separate too. That's why the people keep depicting Adam and Eve as white and usually blonde hair, blue-eyed.
Well, the Garden of Eden was understood to be from Mesopotamia, between the rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. So we have about a minute left here, Aron, and we could talk for hours about all of this. But just briefly, in a few seconds, what can we do? What can our viewers do to help combat this anti-science attitude?
Well, we're doing a lot of it through social media. Social media is working out to our advantage, whether it's in Twitter or Facebook or what have you, that people are making these arguments. I used YouTube, which is a social media platform, to get out these messages because I know that people can't get a full-on education and they're not going to pick up all of this information on their own. So you have to be able to show them where are the important bits that are relevant to this discussion. And I think that people's activism on social media is the best way to do that.
Thank you, Aron Ra, for joining. It's always fun talking with you. You have so much to say. Thanks for being on our show today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters, because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.